The adolescent brain is extremely vulnerable to drugs. And I'm going to go through some basic science with you to try to make it clear as to why. The adolescent brain is developing. It is not mature. It is not an adult brain. It's quite different. The frontal cortex, which is the part of the brain right here that governs our decision-making, our programming, our planning, our ability to judge cost and benefit, that is very immature in the early adolescent. The adolescents are vulnerable to risk-seeking, to drug effects, and different drugs that affect the brain differently. The adolescent is more susceptible to the negative effects of substance use, more susceptible to developing addiction, more susceptible to developing more quickly. And the drug reward in an adolescent is stronger than an adult. This has been shown repeatedly in several different models. The adolescent brain is susceptible to drug-induced brain changes, to worsening mental health problems and to developing new ones, to greater risk-taking and to overdose. And if use continues into adulthood, the adolescent is more prone to long-term effects on their educational achievement, on their jobs, on their relationships. They're more prone to developing addiction when they're adults, and they're more difficult to recover from addiction. It is more difficult if you start young. And they're more susceptible to compromised health and compromised mental health and reduced lifespan. Why? We can make these statements and claims, but what is the evidence behind them? What drives this? Let's take a deeper dive into this. The adolescent brain is undergoing remodeling. It's undergoing changes in white matter and gray matter. White matter is the insulation. It's the plastic around electrical wires that prevents wires from shocking you or cross-talking with other electrical circuits. The gray matter is the essence, the heart and soul of the brain. We have, and I'm going to ask the audience, how many of you would like to guess how many brain cells does an adolescent or adult have? Anybody wish to guess? Nobody? Nobody. I'm sure there are many people who know, but it's about 88 billion nerve cells. 88 billion. And other cells in the brain that are involved in immunity and other responses are double, triple, quadruple that. The adolescent brain prunes connections that it doesn't need. It strengthens other connections. It changes functionally. And the maturation begins at the back of the brain, the most primitive part of the brain, and slowly, slowly moves forward from the age of 5 until the age of 25. The maturation occurs, and finally, at the age of 25, the front part of the brain that does many of the functions that make us human, that finally becomes mature. So that we remove unnecessary connections in the brain, we reorganize the brain circuits, we strengthen important connections, we prune connections that are unnecessary to optimize what's really important for growing up. It makes our ability to think and process information more quickly. It makes it more efficient. It enables us to refine skills. The teen brain also does what's called myelination. It means it adds these layers and layers of insulation on the wires that go from one nerve cell to another. And what this myelination does is it increases the rate at which we process thoughts. If somebody asks a 2-year-old, what is 1 + 1, they may take 5 minutes, or they may not even be able to solve it. If you ask a 14-year-old, it just pops out of their head because we make these very, very rapid connections and ability to communicate our thoughts with inside our brain. So all these changes are occurring, and one of the most interesting ones is that the frontal cortex right here, which is involved in decision-making and planning and attention and problem-solving, that frontal cortex begins to take control of the rest of the brain. It begins to dampen our impulses. It begins to dampen our emotions. It begins to dampen the parts of the brain that make us do gut reactions, thoughtless responses to things. So that over time, the frontal cortex begins to control a very critical emotional part of the brain involved in risk-seeking, involved in emotional reactions that are thoughtless, and it also begins to take control to some extent of the reward center so that it dampens the effects of reward. So here is a study that was done many years ago in which an adolescent group was shown photographs with emotional faces, angry faces, sad faces, and they were asked to judge what they saw. And there was one part of the brain that just lit up in what's called a functional MRI, magnetic resonance imaging instrument. And the part of the brain that lit up was the amygdala, which is emotional, seeks risk, sensations, and novelty. It's also very important for survival. The frontal cortex, which can dampen these emotions, was very quiet. When the same study was done with an adult, the same faces, the emotional part of the brain was almost silent. But the frontal cortex lit up. It was judging, trying to characterize, trying to size up. It's the part of the brain that's involved in self-regulation, in judgment, in reasoning. So it is not the adult brain. Now, what is the risk of drug use to this developing brain? The chemical signals that are used to mature and remodel the brain, they're used to develop connections and circuits. They're critical. Those chemical signals come from many different types of nerve cells. One of them is the cannabinoid system of the brain, the system in which marijuana acts on. Drugs can interfere with brain development because they mimic, they look like, they're imposters of our own brain's chemical systems. They can disrupt the signaling. They can cause the brain to adapt to abnormal signals. They can change cell biology. They can worsen adverse events, and preventing frequent, even moderate use is crucial for reducing the risk of addiction. For every year use of a substance that is delayed, it reduces the risk of developing a substance use disorder. This is an example from one of the researchers at Harvard Medical School, this tangled web. Every single one of those wires, those filaments, they're called axons, dendrites, they all have to hook up in a perfect sequence, like a magnificent ballet. They have to find their partners where they're going to communicate. And the way they wire up and hook up and develop circuits that enable us to be human, that is by chemical signals. And drugs mimic those signals and interfere with this perfect wiring diagram. So THC resembles, but is not identical to 2-arachidonyl glycerol or 2-AG or anandamide. Anandamide looks like THC. Anandamide is made by the brain. THC is made by the marijuana plant. And cannabinoids regulate brain development. They regulate it at the time of the fetus, they regulate it at birth, during infancy, during childhood, they regulate it during adolescence and adulthood. They're critical for brain development, for the formation of new cells, different cell types, how the cells migrate to their targets, this beautiful orchestrated dance. And THC can interfere with these processes because it looks like the chemical signal that the brain makes for developing all these critical steps in maturation.